We're going to be talking about 007 Quantum of Solace. This is like a late 2000s 007 game, and at the time, it got some pretty like decent praise. I don't really know why people liked it, but it was a game that is more or less like a mix of cover shooting with like stealth kind of CQC kind of stuff going on. And I was always interested in it because A, I'm just a really big fan of the Wii as a whole, and B, I like shooters on the Wii. I think the pointer controls with shooters is really cool, and I think it's like one of the more engaging ways to play a shooter, and one of the more unique ways to play a shooter. And it does feel kind of like this bridge point between what we have with gyro aiming today, but with the IR pointer instead of the gyro controls. And gyro aiming has its benefits, but yeah, I think the Wii pointer in some ways still feels pretty unique. So, but this is one of those games that launched on like 7 different platforms, so it has a lot of problems. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But in the end, despite all those issues, I really enjoyed it. So it's a mix of like first person and third person shooting primarily. It basically has you go into first person when you're moving around. And then also when you go into cover, it puts it into third person kind of thing. There's also like this weird lock-on system and things like that. So it's kind of weird to target enemies and shoot them sometimes because the game really wants you to lock on to certain things when you aim down sights. So sometimes you want to shoot something, you just can't because the game really wants you shooting at something else. But overall, it works okay. The game's like pretty linear in its move or in how it progresses. So a lot of times the enemies are in front of you. It doesn't run too much into that Wii issue of like people behind you kind of thing, unless you're like very intentionally running past them. But it's a very action-packed game with like occasional bits and stealth. The QTEs in the Wii version in particular are really cool. Basically, you kind of walk up to an enemy, swing the Wii remote, and you have to point to a spot on the screen, and then also press the A button. And usually that spot on the screen seems to be kind of lined up with the animation on screen as well. So it's this really satisfying feeling anytime you QTE someone and basically knock them down. And that's really the only melee in this game, is those like kind of like cinematic little encounters that you do. Its whole game is very set piece focused in general, and every encounter feels like really crafted. So I think if you are into games that feel like something's happening at all times, 007 Quantum Solace is like really cool in that regard. Part of one of the things I really like about 007 games, honestly, is the general just like variety of environments and things like that, right? There are levels that are, in caves, and some in sewers and warehouses and casinos and stuff like that. And not only is it just like an aesthetic place that you can kind of like shoot through, I think a lot of times there's also a lot of mechanical aspects of the game as well that are pretty unique. When you're in the casino, at one point you're like playing cards and you get drugged basically, and you have to kind of like navigate your way out of the casino while being drugged, and it's like this weirdly disorienting experience that in some ways I feel like the Wii helps with, because the game kind of controls a little strangely at times, so you kind of like are wobbling through this casino. There's this like really cool tower sequence where you're like going through, and just like the whole tower is basically flooding and things like that, and it's like leaning around at the same time while you're in the tower and shooting. So like the level's just like shifting while you're going around and in this gunfight kind of thing. There's like a train level where you're like going through and clearing train cars and things like that. So it's just like every moment of this game, it feels like something different's happening, and I think that's like really cool. I will say narratively, I have no idea what's going on in this game. I have never watched 007. I have played 007 GoldenEye and a couple other games. I don't even remember which ones. Nightfire on like PC, which is also a weirdly busted version of that game, I feel like. So apparently some of these levels are like from other movies, called ones being like Casino Royale. I went and looked up some clips because I was really curious, like if these sequences were inspired by sections of the movie, but it seems like I kept pulling up like different movies. So I think a lot of these come from like what the main actor had acted in. Like, I think his name's Daniel Craig or something. And so, I'm far from a Bond expert. I'm the least Bond expert person to be here probably, but I think the games themselves are pretty cool. And if you don't know James Bond, I think you're probably in the similar situation with me, where it's just like, I don't really know what's happening narratively here. And things like that. Unfortunately, as much as I like this game, there's a lot of things that I kind of don't like about it, Primarily, the controls are a bit of a mess. I don't know what it is about this game, but like there's just not a lot of feedback when you shoot people. I don't know if it's like lacks the Call of Duty like, you know, tag marker sound effect when you hit people. There's also like this weird problem with like guns get kind of like stuck in your view, and so it's like really hard to see past them and stuff sometimes unless you're using like a pistol or something like that. And then also, because the game feels like it really wants you kind of rush in at times and kind of get on top of enemies to like melee them down. Sometimes the finickiness of the Wii remote and your ability to kind of track enemies at close range just feels a bit odd there. Also, I don't know why, but the early part of this game in particular on the Wii has a lot of frame rate issues. I feel like the later levels, it's not nearly as bad. But the early stuff in particular, I do think are kind of rough. And then also, I experienced a large number of crashes on the Wii version of the game, unfortunately. So I did look into the 360 and PS3 version of this game a little bit, and I did feel like those versions of the games appeared to be more consistent in their quality. I feel like the gunplay and the melee combat mix seemed better. It just seemed easier to track what's going on and things like that. But ultimately, I think the Wii version of this game is cooler. Well, not, I shouldn't say is cooler. The Wii version of the game has its own appeal with its like the ability to use QTEs and things like that in a kind of a unique and interesting way. There's also some scenes like the drug scene in particular. For some reason on the 360 and PS3, that scene doesn't look nearly as disorienting. It's just the way they applied those effects is different. And then also in the tower scene I was mentioning earlier that like tilts back and forth while you're in a gunfight, it doesn't do that in those versions of the game as well. So I feel like the Wii version has some unique elements that are or at least, you know, from the outside, it seems like there are some unique elements that make this version of the game worth suffering through as long as you're willing to like put up with frame rate issues and things like that as well. If you're watching the video, you can just see where the game just crashed on me in that video. So, anyways, you know, it's really tough to like recommend the game too much because it is such a train wreck of a game when it comes to its performance. But if you're like me and that doesn't really bother you that much, I will say this game did kind of push me to my limit at times. I was very frustrated by how often I had to kind of restart segments and things like that. It's still worth it in my opinion. I'm very glad I played through this game despite all the issues that I had with it and things like that. So